First time wearing this thing, sorry. Don loves my titles. I love it. I love it. If you are visiting with us today, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. Your presence means so much to me. You really have no idea. So thank you so much for being here. If you don't know, we do have a fellowship meal planned afterwards, and the theme is fair foods. So I hope you brought your Lipitor. I hope you brought your insulin. Okay, it's going to be a fun time, a lot of good food. If you didn't bring anything, that's fine. There is always plenty. I will just have to eat a little bit less, which is probably good for me, okay? So if you can stay after and spend some time with us, you are more than welcome to do so. We would love to have some time to spend with you. A few weeks ago, Craig and I actually both taught lessons at family camp. It was on the same day, so we drove down together. And Craig taught first. He was the whole class, and he taught a class on the Sermon on the Mount, which is pretty good because he's done focused on that a lot here. And then I went second, and I had the men's class. And the class went very well, and afterwards, Craig came up to me and said, "Man, great job, I loved it." I was like, "Oh, thank you so much, And he said, you could turn that into a sermon." And I was like, "Do you think so?" He's like, "Oh, yeah." And he gave me a couple pointers, like you could change this around. And I said, "Oh, yeah, I guess I could do that." And he goes, "You want to teach for me in 2 weeks?" So Craig, if you're watching, I'm on to you. And I know your tricks. You didn't fool anyone. So here I am. And today's sermon is an alteration of that class to make it more of a one-sided discussion instead of a two-sided discussion. But I hope you like it, and I hope, if nothing else, you can take something away today and do a little self-reflection about yourself. So I've never really known anybody who didn't have a weakness. Even the great mythological hero Achilles had a heel, right? For instance, you would never want me, for my weaknesses, you'd never want me to pick out your clothes for you. My lack of color awareness, my overall disinterest in fashion, and my loathing of any type of shopping make me quite possibly the worst person in the world to help you buy your clothes. I'm also pretty bad at anything involving poetry or literature. Spotting symbolism and foreshadowing in stories is not my thing. If you have an English paper to write on a famous piece of literature for your own sake, don't come to me. I also really don't know how to fix your car. Having driven for about 22 years, I might have half of a clue of what could be wrong with it, but I would never, ever try to fix it on my own. That would be bad for me and you and your car. You don't want me doing that. So what's my point with this? Well, the thing is, while we all have our own weaknesses, we also have our own strengths, don't we? I can't pick out your clothes for you, but I could help you with your math problem. I won't understand your poem, but I could teach a Bible class for you if you needed it. I can't fix your car. Logan can. I can't fix your car, but I could help you install a hardwood floor if you might need that. You see, as I look around today, I see a diverse group of people with a wide range of skill sets. We're not all the same here, are we? Guess what? God knew that we wouldn't all be the same. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 12. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, starting at verse 12. God knew we wouldn't all be the same. And the passage we're going to read here is in the context of miraculous spiritual gifts. So I'm deviating from the text a little bit, but I think the idea can be well applied. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, starting at verse 12. For even as the body is one, and yet has many members, and all the members of the body, though they are many, are one body, so also is Christ. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit. For the body is not one member, but many. If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I am not part of the body, it is not for this reason any the less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I'm not part of the body, it is not for this reason any the less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? But now God has placed the members, each one of them in the body, just as he desired. Do you believe that last verse, church family? Do you believe that God placed you in this church body for an intended purpose? Do you have skills in this that you possess that others in this church body maybe don't? Do you see the skills that some have complementing the skills that others have? I know I've seen that here. Doing a VBS 2 weeks ago, I saw the different skills that we all had working together to do something great for the community, for example. Okay? It was a great way to reach out to others, and we saw different people fulfilling different roles, all working together as one body. So now let me ask you, what are your skills? What are you good at? Everybody has abilities, right? So again, what are yours? I want you to think about that for a few minutes. I want you to think about at least 3 things that you are good at. By the way, they don't necessarily have to be skills that would be directly related to religion. For example, out of the 3 strengths that I listed, math, teaching Bible classes, and hardwood floors, only one of them really relates directly to the workings of this congregation. So think, what are your skills? What are you good at? Do you have at least 3? If we all do, we're ready to move on to the major theme of the lesson today, which is generosity. Let's read Proverbs 11:25 again, that Don just read a few moments ago. Proverbs 11 and verse 25. The generous man will be prosperous, and he who waters will himself be watered. Beautiful words, right? The generous man will be prosperous, and he who waters will himself be watered. We'll talk more about this as we move along today. But I do want to establish one very important fact before we move along. Now, I don't need to see a show of hands here, but I just wanted to ask you this question, okay? When somebody refers to another person as being generous, what's the first thought that pops into your mind about that individual? Someone calls someone else generous, okay? Now, if this group is like the men's group that I taught this class a few weeks ago, most of your minds probably went to generous with money, okay? If yours went there first, don't worry. I think mine went there first too, okay? But I want to challenge us to change our mindset on generosity. While generosity can be in the context of money, it doesn't have to be, does it? In fact, when I die someday, I hope that others will view me as a generous person, even if they don't know how much I give every week. Let's be honest here, for many of us, writing a check is easier than actually doing something, isn't it? For some of us, writing a check is easier than actually doing something, okay? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not speaking badly of those who financially support this congregation. Trust me, I'm the treasurer here, okay? Please, if you're supporting this congregation financially, continue to do so. Please continue to do so, okay? I just want us to adjust our mindset here. Beyond money, how can we use our skills to support, nurture, and grow this church? How can you use your skills to support, nurture, and grow this church? How can I be more generous with my skills? And how can you be more generous with yours? If you leave here today with thoughts on how you can be more generous with the God-given gifts that you have, then I've succeeded with my lesson today. Okay? Let's think about some biblical examples of generosity. You might think of the widow who gave her only 2 mites. She was surely a great example, was she not? But her story is, at least in a superficial way, centered on money. You might also think of the Good Samaritan. According to Luke 10:35, the Samaritan gave 2 denarii to the innkeeper for expenses for the injured man. That's 2 days' worth of money, folks. I want you to add up how much money you make in 2 days and then ask yourself if you'd sacrifice that much money for a person that you didn't even know. However, even though the Samaritan was generous with his money, I think that's just an afterthought of what he did for this man. Most importantly, he was generous with his compassion. The Samaritan bandaged the injured man's wounds. He poured oil and wine on them. He put him on his own animal, likely walking the rest of the way to the town. If you ask me, his generosity with his money is an afterthought to his generosity with his compassion and his love. Hopefully, you're also thinking of Jesus' generosity, the ultimate example of what we try to be. Was Jesus generous? Do you ever remember him giving money to anyone? To my knowledge, the only time Jesus gives anybody money in the Bible is when he pays the temple tax. But, humorously enough, the money didn't even come out of his own pocket. It came out of the mouth of a fish. Okay? But we still see Jesus being generous, not with his money, but with his time, his love, and his compassion. Could you imagine being constantly bombarded by people everywhere you went? Could you imagine constant requests for healings? Could you imagine requests for teachings? Oftentimes by people who just wanted to see a magic show or just trying to trip you up so they could kill you. And yet Jesus' generosity continued, culminating in the greatest example of his generosity, the gift of his very life. Let's read one good story that shows his generosity. Let's go to Mark 5. Mark 5, starting at verse 21. There's actually kind of 2 stories wrapped up into one here. Mark 5, starting at verse 21. Mark 5:21, we're going to read to verse 42. And when Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered about him, and he stayed by the seashore. And one of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up, and upon seeing him fell at his feet, and entreated him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her, that she may get well and live." And he went off with him, and a great multitude was following him and pressing in on him. And a woman who had had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured much at the hands of many physicians and had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse, after hearing about Jesus, came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak. For she thought, "If I just touch his garments, I shall get well." Well, she was right. And immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. And immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power proceeding from him had gone forth, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the multitude pressing in on you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see the woman who had done this. But the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." While he was still speaking, they came from the house of the synagogue official, saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore?" But Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken, said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid any longer, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And he came to the house of the synagogue official, and he beheld a commotion and people loudly weeping and wailing. And entering in, he said to them, "Why make a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep." And they began laughing at him. But putting them all out, he took along the child's father and mother and his own companions and entered the room where the child was. And taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which translated means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl rose and began to walk, for she was 12 years old, and immediately they were completely astounded. Do you ever notice before how these two miracles were intertwined? I'd say the miracle of curing the bleeding woman is actually probably a little more well-known, but did you ever notice that it occurred while Jesus was actually going out of his way to heal an official's daughter? Who knows how long that walk was? We see in verse 24 that a great multitude was pressing in on him. That was his life, was it not? This entire passage shows us not only what life was like for Jesus, but his amazing generosity with his time, love, and compassion. While I know you don't have the same abilities that Jesus had, what abilities do you have? I'm not asking you to do what Jesus did. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you that. Okay? But I'm asking you to act the way he acted with the gifts that you do have. If we go back to the verse of the day, Proverbs 11:25, is being generous always going to lead to others being generous with us? Are we guaranteed to gain earthly rewards with our generosity? And I would say, of course not. Now, do I think that others are more likely to help someone whom they view as being generous? And I would say yes, I would agree with that. We're more likely to help others that we think that they're generous. However, if we're generous with others simply so that they'll be generous with us, then aren't we really missing the point of being generous? Okay? If I'm just bartering my skills for someone else's skills, that's not really generosity. It's called free trade. Okay? We want to be generous with our abilities. Let's read Luke 6, starting at verse 30. Luke 6, starting at verse 30. Luke 6, starting at verse 30. "Give to everyone who asks of you, and whoever takes away what is yours, do not demand it back. And just as you want people to treat you, treat them in the same way. And if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners in order to receive back the same amount. But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he himself is kind to ungrateful and evil men." Expect nothing in return, church family, and your reward will be great. You see, I don't think Proverbs 11:25 is talking about being prosperous in an earthly way at all, but a heavenly way. While the earth won't necessarily water us, the Lord will surely water us. That is the water we strive for, is it not? Wouldn't we take a drop of God's water over a pool full of earthly water any day of the week? For my last thought, some of you might be wondering how your skills can make a difference in this church. To use me as an example, you might be wondering how math and hardwood floors can help this church family. You can easily see the connection with the teaching of the Bible classes, but what about the other two? In short, it boils down to relationships, doesn't it? You see, if we're generous with our time and resources, that will help us build the relationships that we need to spread the gospel to others. Now, I know from experience that having a good relationship with someone doesn't guarantee that they will be converted to Christ. I am well aware of it. But let's face it, there aren't many Ethiopian eunuchs out there. Are there? Let's read Acts chapter 8, starting at verse 25. Acts chapter 8, starting at verse 25. As I read this, ask yourself, how many personal stories do you know that went like this? Okay. Acts 8, verse 25. And so when they had solemnly testified and spoken the word of the Lord, they started back to Jerusalem and were preaching the gospel to many villages of the Samaritans. But an angel of the Lord spoke to Philip, saying, "Arise and go south to the road that descends from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a desert road." And he arose and went, and behold, there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who was in charge of all her treasure, and he had come to Jerusalem to worship. And he was returning and sitting in his chariot and was reading the prophet Isaiah. And the Spirit said to Philip, "Go up and join this chariot." And when Philip had run up, he heard him reading Isaiah the prophet and said, "Do you understand what you are reading?" And he said, "Well, how could I unless someone guides me?" And he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. Now the passage of Scripture which he was reading was this: "He was led as a sheep to slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he does not open his mouth. In humiliation his judgment was taken away. Who shall relate his generation? For his life is removed from the earth." And the eunuch answered Philip and said, "Please tell me, of whom does the prophet say this? Of himself or of someone else?" And Philip opened his mouth, and beginning from the Scripture, he preached Jesus to him. And as they went along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, water! What prevents me from being baptized?" And Philip said, "If you believe with all your heart, you may." And he answered and said, "I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God." And he ordered the chariot to stop, and they both went down into the water, Philip as well as the eunuch, and he baptized him. And when they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away, and the eunuch saw him no more, but went on his way rejoicing. How many people do you know who heard one lesson and then decided to become a Christian afterwards by being baptized into the first body of water they came across? Doesn't happen very much, does it? How many people outside of this congregation are willing to approach you for help with a biblical idea? How many are willing to admit they need guidance, just like the eunuch did? This doesn't happen very often. Generally, these things take time, and showing generosity helps to build the foundation that makes spreading this gospel possible. On the flip side, sometimes our generosity helps in keeping our existing flock together. Who here can think of something a fellow member here did for you that strengthened your faith? I bet all of us could come up with multiple examples of that. As we've seen here, let us not take our congregational brothers and sisters for granted. We don't always know when one of our own is wavering in their faith. Let's try to build those relationships, not just with those outside of the family, but inside as well. If even one soul can be saved through our actions, what a difference we have made to that soul. In closing, I truly hope everyone here can take some time over the coming days to think about their skills and how they can be used to further Christ's kingdom. Any skill can do it. Any skill can do it. Any skill can be the springboard to a better relationship and, in turn, a greater possibility of preaching this gospel. But we have to look for the opportunities to use our talents. I hope we can all make personal goals in wanting to be more generous, just as Christ is generous with us. If nothing else, even if we never convert a single soul, we will build up for ourselves treasures in heaven and show Christ's love to all people. Let's conclude by reading Matthew 6, verse 19 and 20. Matthew 6, verses 19 and 20. "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal." Let's do that, okay? Let's build those heavenly treasures, show others the way, and help them build their own heavenly treasures. What greater gift can any one of us give to another than the gift of our Savior, Jesus Christ? Now, if you're here today and you think that you've been struggling as a Christian, maybe you haven't been as generous with your talents as you could have been, maybe you're entangled in sin in some way, please come forward and one of the elders here will speak with you and we'll pray for you. If you have never become a Christian, you'd like to be baptized into Christ today, we can do that for you as well. Anything you need from us, please come forward and sit in one of the front pews as we stand and sing.